across a number of South Asian countries today over China's crackdown against the unrest in Tibet. And what continues to be wrapped into all of that chaos is the Olympic torch and the Beijing Olympics.
Despite heavy security along the route, officials had to snuff out the torch flame at least thrice as anti-China protesters tried to grab it and block the relay. Finally, after several delays, organizers decided to transport the torch on a bus to the relay's endpoint, where it arrived 30 minutes late. Police sources say 28 demonstrators were arrested. The Paris protests come a day after 37 people were arrested in London following a number of protests along the torch relay route there on Sunday. Meanwhile, hundreds of Tibetan exiles in northern India shaved their heads and donated blood in fresh protests against China's crackdown in Tibet. Several women were among those who decided to go bald as part of the peaceful protest, and a blood donation camp was also organized as part of the protests. And in Nepal's capital, Kathmandu, Buddhist monks held a special prayer session today for the victims of the Lhasa riots, while Tibetan exiles also had their heads shaved as a symbolic protest against China's rule in Tibet.
The reason of making us bald is all because of that. We don't have any human rights in Tibet. Though we are human, we don't have human rights in Tibet.
Tibetan exiles in Nepal have suspended anti-China protests because of the upcoming elections this week. The Olympic torch is due to arrive in San Francisco this Wednesday for its only North American stop. And as a sign of protest against its upcoming arrival and China's human rights record, pro-Tibetan demonstrators scaled the Golden Gate Bridge. Wearing harnesses and helmets as they made their way up the bridge cables, the protesters tied the Tibetan flag and banners with pro-Tibetan slogans written on them on the bridge. Rallies, vigils, and news conferences related to the torch's arrival have taken place in San Francisco almost daily for the past several weeks, and more are planned over the next 2 days.
This is a city that has long stood for human rights and for freedom. And so we really feel this is a time when the people of San Francisco and when Tibetans in the area and supporters must take a stand for the Tibetans inside Tibet and oppose the brutal crackdown.
In the meantime, the U.S. State Department says diplomatic security agents are working with the San Francisco Police Department to provide security for the arrival of the Olympic torch this Wednesday.
Meanwhile, the Canadian government says Prime Minister Stephen Harper's absence from the Beijing Olympic Games opening ceremony doesn't represent an insult to China.
The Secretary of State for Multiculturalism says the Prime Minister had never intended to go to the opening ceremonies.
I don't recall, I stand to be corrected, but I don't recall any precedent of a Canadian Prime Minister attending the opening ceremonies for Olympics being held overseas. So I think he's actually observing the long-standing practice, and this is no innovation.
Defense Minister Peter MacKay says the government hasn't ruled out a boycott of the Games, saying Cabinet hasn't yet discussed the matter.
Inevitably, we'll be having discussions about it, but the Prime Minister's statement that he won't be attending is a signal of a personal decision that he's taken, but as far as a policy or something reflective of government policy, we have not taken that decision just yet.
Meanwhile, NDP leader Jack Layton is urging the government to pressure China to begin talks with Tibet.
Well, I think that there's a growing awareness now around the world, particularly as the torch moves from country to country. A lot more people are asking questions and trying to understand the issue in Tibet.
The Prime Minister is urging China to take the international concern over human rights in Tibet seriously.
It was an unnerving